I remember my forehead started to sweat as General Peter Corelli, the Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, told us about the most difficult phone call he'd ever had to make in his entire life. He had to call the mother of a young man who'd been killed in Iraq. This young man's convoy had been obliterated by a U.S. airstrike that had struck the wrong location. And Corelli had to call this young man's mother to explain why that happened. What had happened was that a radio operator about 100 miles away in another part of Iraq had called in the coordinates for the airstrike wrong. This young man, this radio operator, had been concussed 4 times in the previous week, and he was so badly injured that he was vomiting in the back of his battered MRAP as he was calling in the numbers. But he told his commanding officers he was good to go, because that's what you did. Everybody knew that concussions were something you shrugged off, except that he wasn't good to go. And that young man's mother was on her way to Dover to pick up her son's possessions and a flag. So, my name's Dave Brody. I'm a neurologist at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm not in the Army, and I never was. So, what was I doing in that briefing room in Bethesda listening to General Corelli? Well, it started because I had met an Army colonel named Stephen Flaherty, and Flaherty and I had a common enemy. We were on the same side in a vigorous scientific debate that had really important policy implications. What had happened was that an Army psychiatrist named Charles Hogue had published a paper stating that all of the consequences of concussive traumatic brain injury were actually due to post-traumatic stress disorder, and that not to concussion itself. And they had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine and had been picked up by the New York Times and had gotten a lot of attention. But Flaherty was the chief of trauma at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Landstuhl, Germany, which was the main triage point for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he'd seen hundreds, sometimes maybe thousands of U.S. service members who'd been evacuated in ambulances that looked like this on their way back from wartime. And to Flaherty, the psychiatrist's view just didn't hold true. I didn't know very much about military concussive traumatic brain injury at the time, but my gut feeling was that Flaherty was right. But to make policy decisions takes more than just gut feelings, it takes data. And I had an idea that I told Flaherty about for how we could get some. The idea involved a new MRI technique called diffusion tensor imaging, which involves tracking the brain's water, tracking the movement of the brain's water with an MRI scanner. We didn't invent diffusion tensor imaging at Washington University, but we got to be the first ones to use it in military concussive traumatic brain injury patients because of the connection that we made with Colonel Flaherty. So let me tell you a little bit about diffusion tensor imaging and why it works. The most vulnerable part of the brain is called the axons. These are long wires that transmit information from one part of the brain to the other. And the axons are like celery. They've got a long direction and shorter directions. And so if you imagine water diffusing in celery, it diffuses really fast up and down the celery, and much more slowly crosswise in the celery or in and out of the celery. But after injury, the brain's axons become like celery soup. Same color as celery, may smell like celery, but quite disrupted. And now the water is going to diffuse pretty much the same in all directions. So we could use diffusion tensor imaging to detect the difference between celery and celery soup in the brain. So we did that. We brought our scanner technology to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Landstuhl, Germany. It just took reprogramming the scanners. The hardware that they had was fine, and we did our study. The smartest move I made, the most fortunate choice I made that day, was bringing with me a genius. This is Christine Mcdonald. She was a postdoctoral fellow in my lab, and she was technically very solid, but she was a true genius when it came to interpersonal relations. She got the injured service members. She understood they were scared, lonely, had been evacuated from Iraq or Afghanistan all the way out to Germany, separated from the men and women with whom they had lived, trained, ate, slept, and sometimes even died, forming bonds that were closer than even those of their own families in many cases. Christine told these service members, this is not about you. This is about the people that are still out there and about helping them in the future. And they got that. 80% of them agreed to participate in our research study, and 2/3 of them still followed up with us even a year later. She's still tracking them now, 5 years after. So we did our study, and what did we find? Well, the first part of the brain we looked at was called the cingulum. The cingulum is a highway of brain wiring that starts in the front and wraps all the way around the back and goes deep inside the brain. With conventional MRI scans, the cingulum looks like this. It looks very similar in the control subject versus the traumatic brain injury subject. You really can't see any difference. The control subjects, by the way, were US military personnel who'd been evacuated from Iraq and Afghanistan for other reasons but did not have any brain injury. So there was no difference. These injuries were invisible to conventional MRI. But when we used diffusion tensor imaging, we could see right away that in the control subject, there's a really bright green. You can see that bright green up and down the middle. That means this is like celery. This part of the brain has very fast water diffusion up and down and much slower right and left and in and out. In contrast, though, the traumatic brain injury subject, the cingulum bundle, is not quite as bright green. The arrows indicate the part of the brain that we're going to analyze quantitatively. And let me show you how that looks. In the control subject, there's high anisotropy in the left cingulum and in the right cingulum. Anisotropy is the word that means directional asymmetry, not the same in all directions. That means fast up and down and slower right and left, like a normal stalk of celery. But the traumatic brain injury subject had lower anisotropy, and now what was invisible is now quite clear. It's quite a bit lower in the traumatic brain injury subject compared with the control. Let me show you another example. This is a part of the brain called the middle cerebellar peduncle, which is in the back part of the brain, especially vulnerable to blast injuries. You don't see any difference between the two scans in the control and the traumatic brain injury subject on a conventional MRI scan. It's another invisible injury. But here's how the control subject looks with diffusion tensor imaging. Again, there's this beautiful bright green areas across the sides of this middle cerebellar peduncle. And in the traumatic brain injury subject, it's dramatically reduced. It's really ragged. There's much less bright green. Here's the area that we're going to analyze quantitatively on both sides. And here's the data. In the control subject, there's high anisotropy in the left and right middle cerebellar peduncle. And in the traumatic brain injury subject, it's wiped out. There's hardly any anisotropy at all. This one is not subtle at all once we had diffusion tensor imaging to look at it. Here's a third example. This is the orbital frontal white matter. This is an important part of the brain right up in the front part of the brain that's involved in emotional regulation and decision-making processes. Here's how it looks in a control and a traumatic brain injury patient. In conventional MRI scan, no different. Can't see anything wrong here. In the control subject, there's very bright green. It's very beautifully intact. And in the traumatic brain injury subject, it's not quite right. It's reduced anisotropy. Here's the data. High in the control subject, not as high in the traumatic brain injury subject. You guys get the idea. So by the time we finished the study, we were able to detect clear abnormalities in 18 out of 63 US military personnel. Only one had any abnormalities at all on conventional imaging technology, anything that we had prior, and none of the controls had any abnormalities at all. So we reported our data in scientific meetings, and we published it in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the New York Times picked it up in media outlets around the world. So our side, Flaherty and I, with Mcdonald, and the Army psychiatrist, Hogues, had a pretty equal opportunity to present our work to the people that made the important decisions. And in the end, the decision was made. And the decision came out in a document that was really rather bland looking, and this is called a directive type memorandum. But it established policy for over 1 million US service members around the world for how concussion would be handled. And this directive type memorandum was the new beginning. After the directive type memorandum, a radio operator who'd been concussed would not have been told he was good to go, or get back to work, or shake it off. He would have been treated in a warrior recovery center like this one in Kandahar, Afghanistan, which I visited in 2011. And at that warrior recovery center, he'd be treated by people who were well educated about concussion. And he'd have scheduled sleep, and powerful yet safe non-narcotic pain medications. He'd get education about concussion, strict regulation of caffeine use, acupuncture and physical therapy if necessary, and be treated in an environment where stigma was not an issue. So, most importantly, he'd be returned to duty only after passing objective performance evaluations, typically 12 to 14 days after a concussive event. So what now? The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are largely over for the US military, but we need to keep going. Our new technology coming out of Washington University is now so much better than what we had in 2007 to 2009 that I'm almost embarrassed to look at those old images in those days. And it's a good thing, too, because we need to do better. We need to be able to get 63 out of 63. Why does this matter to you? This matters to you because if your son or daughter has a concussion playing soccer or football, or if you have a car accident or a fall or an assault, or any of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that affect us in our daily lives that can cause concussion, we need to be able to detect it so that we can treat it appropriately in the future. Just as in all of history, war has led to advances in trauma care, helicopter ambulances, and blood banks ready to give transfusions. We hope that this technology that we're learning about from visualizing the invisible wounds of war in Iraq and Afghanistan will translate to improved concussion care in our world, in our civilian world, and for every one of you and your families. Thank you.